Hey everyone, welcome back to QA and Dev Tips. Today we are going to learn something that is used in almost every Python program: functions, and more importantly, how parameters and return values actually work. Now, this is a very important topic because once you understand functions, your code becomes cleaner, reusable, and much more professional. So let's start simple. What is a function? A function is a block of code and that does a specific task, and you can call that function, that is reuse the function again and again. Instead of writing the same code multiple times, you write it once and call it whenever you need. So let's start with the basic example here. We have here a function named greet that prints hello. So whenever you want to print hello in your program, all you need to do is call this method, and you can call it as many times as you want. So let's say I want to call it in different line 5. Let's say this is another line 100 in your program, and wherever you call it, this line of code is executed. So you don't need to type the word print hello again and again because you have it here in a function that is reusable. All you need to do is call its name. That's the output. That's it. So now let's understand the structure. So here we have this def is the one keyword that you need to use, and whenever you need to create a function, you need to give the def and then the function name and then the block of code. You can have one line of code or you can have 100 lines of code, any Python code, if, for, else, while loop, or any logic, or simply return any valid code inside this is executed whenever you call the function. So that's how it works. So def defines the function and you give the function name, and the parenthesis is where the parameters go. Now let's make it useful. Instead of always saying hello, what if we want to greet different people? That's where the parameters come. Right now it's printing the hard-coded value here. Now let's parameterize this so it will change the name. You can supply your own name, so you can say hello and say hello to the person. So you can have something like hello user 1, hello user 2. So for example, so here I have two different calls, and when I run this program, it is going to it is going to print hello user 2, user 1, user 3. These user, so the parameters passed here go here and get substituted in the name, and wherever the name comes, it prints the actual value of the parameter. So now your function is dynamic. So let's go one step further. What if your function has multiple parameters? Yes, you can have, instead of one parameter here, you can have multiple parameters. For example, you can build a addition method where you have two parameters, or you can have three parameters, a, b, c, and so on, and then you can say a plus b plus c. So it will print your and then you can call it in your program something like this. So you can say add of 1, 2, and 10, and your program works fine. And you can see here it doesn't, let's see. So you can see the output is the sum of all these numbers because that's what you needed. So when you want to add and print numbers later in the program with different values, all you need to do is call this method with different values and it's going to work. So you don't need to write the same print statement again and again. So that's very reusable. And now here is a very important concept. Right now we are using print, but in real programming we don't just print, we return values. And let's see the difference here. I'm going to make this method the same method, but it's not printing. It's using the keyword return. What that means is it's going to return the result back to the program that calls this method. So in your program, you can call this method and it's going to return the value. You can store the return value in a variable and then use that variable in whatever way you want to use it. So when I run the program, it's printing the 8, and you can also do it anything you want with this variable. So you can add an 8, or you can pass it to a iteration in a loop. So you can see here we can get the output from the program, from the method, using the return keyword. So that's what is happening here. So simply say this return sends the value back to the program, and we can do it, store it in a variable here. So here is the key difference. Print that we had before simply shows the output, but the return gives the output back to the program. It doesn't go to the output terminal. Rather, it's going to go to the program where that method was called. So it's going to return it, and we can store it and use it later in the program. So this is extremely important in real world coding, because most of the time you want to use the result later, right? Now let's see what happens if we do not use the return statement. So let's say I have another example where we have a method that has the print and it doesn't have the return. So when we call this method, it's going to print the output, and we are trying to expect a return from the value and trying to store it in a variable. So let's see what happens when we try to print the result. So you can see here it is printing the output because we call the method, and 5 plus 8 is 8. And then when we try to store the result and print it, we got the none. Why none? Because the function did not return anything. Now let's talk about default parameters. We saw function can accept one or more parameters, but if the calling program doesn't supply any parameter, let's say I have a greet method here, and in the program, if I don't use a parameter to call this method, it is going to use the default value. So when I run this program, you see the first call to the method prints hello and the name guest, because the guest is the default, because we didn't supply no value was passed, so default is used. But if you pass it, it's going to print the normal way. That's what we see here. And now let's talk about the keyword arguments. The arguments, so let's take a look at this method. So we here have the user underscore info, and this is the name and the age, and you can call this in a different way, and you can call this method like this. So you can call the method name, and then the age equals 25 and name equals user1. So the order doesn't matter here. So when I run the program, it's still going to print the name user, which is what the order defined in the method. But when you call the method, you can change the order like this. So that's what is called the keyword arguments. You mention the name of the key parameter name, and then you do this. Suppose, let's see what happens if I don't do this. So here it prints 25 users, because here it's 25 directly goes to the order. So it thinks the name, the first parameter is 25 and the second parameter is user1. But if you want to change that, you can force that by using the parameter name. So it goes right to the correct parameter age. So you get the user 25 instead of the 25 user. So that's how useful this keyword arguments, so that the order doesn't matter as long as you provide the parameter name and then the value in this format. Now let's talk about returning multiple values. Now this is where it gets more interesting, and you can see how Python is so flexible. So here we have a calculator that does the addition and multiplication both and returns both. So this is very useful when you want to have multiple outputs. And in the calling program, we can call this method and it's going to return the addition and the multiplication. So you can store the variable, each return output, in separate variables separated by comma. So automatically Python returns this as a tuple, and if I run this program, I get the 8 and the 15. So that's how, this is something that beginners will love it. So this is how it gets converted into tuple, and then you can get it here. Now it can return as many variables, return values. So we can say a/b, and then you can see how it works. So you can see here, it doesn't have to be 2, it can be 3, 4, or as many as you want. And then in your return and your calling program, you have the variables here, and then you do it in a very few lines of code. Instead of creating a separate method for addition, subtraction, or division, you just use one method, and that is called the calculator method or calc method. So that's how you do. And now let's talk about a real world example. Now imagine that you are validating API responses, and you can use a method something like this. And let me see. So here we have this method. So we can have a yes_success, and you can pass the status code and return the status code as 100. And then in the calling program, you can call this method, and then it's going to return the boolean true, because it is comparing the 200 with the actual value. So the output you get is true. So this is how you use it in your program. So another example is processing a user data, for example. For example, I have here the format user, and I have the username and the role, and then in the program I can call this method like this. So print of format user, so it's going to print the user is an admin. So you can see how you formed a sentence here. So this is a useful method if you want to format. And let's now talk about scope. This is very important. Variables inside the functions are local. So let me show you with another example. So you see a variable x here defined, and it is inside this function. And when we try to run the program, let's see what happens. So you see here the output is 10 because it is coming from the program. And if you want to do something like this, it's not going to work, because the x is defined here, and that is scoped, that is only valid when you use it inside this function. So inside the function you can call the x and do a multiplication or division or anything with the variable. So that variable is visible only within the method, as you can see here, the method. So outside of this method, it doesn't know what is x. So that's how we know x doesn't work, because x is local to the function. So now let's talk about global function. Let's make the variable visible outside the function as well as inside the function. So instead of having the x equals 5 inside the function, we put it outside the function. So now when we run the program, it works. Let's run it again. So you can see here the x is 5, and the function method knows that x is 5 because it can see that it is visible globally. That's why it's called global variable. And you see the print x is print 5, and when we call the method sees that variable value 5 and it prints. So this works. Now let's talk about a powerful concept: functions calling other functions. So this is pretty interesting, and let me show you this example code. So we have here a square function that squares a value, whatever value we pass, and then another function, process function, it calls this square function and then adds a 10. So it's like not a chaining, but it's this function calling another function, functions calling another function. So let's run this program. You can see here the 5 is the process, the num 5. So the 5 goes here, the square of 5 is 25, and then we add a 10 to it, so it becomes 35. So that's how powerful this. You can call function inside the function. The square function can later call another function, and you can do like that. So now let's talk about best practices. You should always keep the functions small, and you should give meaningful names to the function. You cannot just call this one as SQ and think. So when another programmer reads your code, he might be wondering what is SQ, and he has to read the code and to understand. Sometimes your method might have hundreds of lines, so he cannot figure out what is the method name is. Here I can say, it's a square method. But if you have hundreds of lines and doing complex logic, you might call a valid name like calculate tax or something, calculate your state tax or something. So give meaningful name, so people, when they read the name of the method, they know that okay, this method is doing the square function, so they can understand. So that's why you need to give meaningful names for readability, and that is one of the best practices. And another one is use return always instead of print, and that is how you can use that, and which is very flexible. You can use that return variable later in your program instead of printing it to the terminal. And more importantly, avoid too many parameters. You cannot have something like x, y, z, or keep it minimum. Like I cannot have too many. This is not a good practice. Now, one more important concept beginners miss is that function can return nothing. Yes, it can return nothing. It doesn't have to return something all the time. Sometimes you just want to return because you might have this function not yet ready, and you might want to come back and add it later. So when I call this method, it's going to return output the value none, because there is nothing to return. So always be clear what your function returns. So let's do one final real world example, and let's take this program that has a method to count all the even numbers. So here you have the list of numbers we pass to the method, and then it initializes the count to 0, and then does a loop of for each number we passed, for each number in the list, it's going to divide it by 0 and check whether it returns a 0. If it's a 0, then it's an even number, and it's going to count the number of even numbers. So you can see how this entire block of line is being executed when I call this. So you can call this as many number of times, 10 times, 20 times, and you don't need to write the same code multiple times. So when I run this code, you see there are 2, 3 even numbers here, and it is very convenient. And later you can change the list or keep this as a variable so it keeps changing, but you can conveniently call the method, which still works fine. So that's how functions are used in real projects. Now, to quickly recap, functions are reusable pieces of block of code. So this is a block of code, and you can reuse it when you give a method name, function name, and the parameter input we saw, and then the parameters are nothing but the input. So here the nums is a parameter, and you give the input, which is the parameter, and the return statement is the output. And my advice, start writing small functions daily, even simple ones, and that's how you improve fast. So if this video helped you, like this video and comment function if you understood, and subscribe for more QA and dev tips and other useful videos. So I will see you in the next one.